Hello everybody, welcome back. Today I have an extremely interesting video for you. In this video, we shall look at something called graphic effects in context of Scratch. Now, graphic effects are these really cool blocks, these really cool tools which allow us to change the looks of our sprites and backdrops within a program. The great thing is that we can use this for almost any kind of Scratch project that we develop, be it animations, be it games, be it stories, and hence these are really interesting, right? So let's look at this video. Let's see in this video what graphic effects are, where can I find them, how can we use them, and what they can do for us, right? So let's get started. What are graphic effects? Well, graphic effects in simple words are tools which allow us to change how a sprite looks without changing its costume. Right now, the important word here is without. We all know that we can use, say, next costume or switch costume to make the sprite look different. However, here we are talking of changing how a sprite looks without changing its costume, right? And in fact, we can apply also this same idea to backdrops as well. So without changing backdrops, we can make a given backdrop look different. Right now, like I said, we can use these as part of the code, and hence they become very useful for creating animations within stories, within games. In fact, lots of projects in Scratch make use of these effects very nicely, right? So like I said, in this video we're looking at this in detail, right? Now the first question is, where do I find these, right? So let's look at the Scratch interface. So if you go to the look section, you will find that sort of if I look at a sprite, if I go to looks, there's lots of things here, but somewhere down below I see these three blocks called change. It says change color effect by 25, set color effect to 0, and clear graphic effect. So really these are the three blocks: change, set, and clear graphic effects. Right now, interestingly, if I click on this drop down, right, if I click this on this drop down, I notice that there's not just one effect, which is the color effect. In fact, there are as many as 7 effects that we are talking about, right? So there's, for example, color, fisheye, whirl, pixelate, mosaic, brightness, and ghost, right? So in this, we will of course go through each one of these, what it does, how can we use it, what are the values that it must be setting it to, and so on and so forth. Now, before I get started with that, notice that the change and set usage is exactly what happens in case of variables. So I can set, say, color or some effect to a particular value, and I can then change its value as the code goes on, right? It's exactly same as any other variable, right? So let's get started one by one through these things. Like I said, there are 7 graphic effects. Let's see the very first one, which is called the color effect. Right now, what this color effect does really is that it changes the hue or the shade of a sprite or a backdrop, right? The best way to understand this is to think through an analogy. Let's say you're looking at the world through tinted glasses, right? So for example, if you wear a pink color glass, then everything around you starts to look pink, right? Similarly, if you wear a green color glass, then everything starts to look to have a greenish tinge, right? So in the same way, we can give this tinge to our sprite by changing its value of this color effect. The valid range for these values is 0 to 200. And color effect of 200 is exactly same as color effect of 0, right? So let's see the example here first, and then I'll show you in a code to see how this thing really works, right? So when I, for example, start with a familiar cat sprite, I set color effect to 0. It looks exactly like whatever it was looking in its basic form. When I change, when I basically say set color effect to 25, so it's like from 0 to 25, notice there's a greenish tinge on this, right? So if you follow this, I go 25, 50, 75, 100, 125, 150, and 175, right? Basically, it goes through from being orange to green, dark green, bluish, dark blue, purple, red, and then back into orange, because the moment it goes back to 200, it's exactly same as the original color, right? But remember one thing, that this is not the absolute color. This is like a tinted glass, right? So if I have something which is, say, blue in color, right, and I change I set a color effect of 25 on this sprite, which is, say, blue in color, it will appear this pinkish color, right? So it's all relative to what the original color was. This is really like a tint on top of that, right? So let's see this as an example. Let's say, for example, I have this cat sprite. So here I've put a simple code that when I click the flag, I'll set color effect to 0, which means that the cat will look like normal. And thereafter, every half a second, I will be changing this color effect by 25. Right now when I see this, it looks pretty cool because now sprite is basically changing its look, even though I'm not changing his costume, so I'm making it appear different. Every now and then it becomes orange again. The reason is because, like I said, a value of 200 is same as the value of 0, right? So it just goes back in one cycle, comes back here, right? Now I can also apply this to backdrop. So I've given the same code on my backdrop. Now I'm just going to choose a few backdrops to illustrate this. For example, take playground. Right now the interesting thing here is that different parts of this backdrop are different colors, so they are going to just follow their own cycle, right? For example, whatever is orangish is going to be pretty much like the cat. Whatever is bluish is going to be somewhat different, and so on and so forth. So we can try another backdrop, say Jurassic. Here notice these parts are actually quite close to orange. In fact, this is almost close as orange. So you notice that this color will follow pretty much the cat's color because it's going through the same cycle, right? So every other color is going to follow similarly, right? We can in fact try this on different backdrops. It looks really cool. Look at, for example, flowers, right? When I do this, then the flowers start to have different colors, right? So you can, like I said, you can do this on sprites or on backdrops, right? Let's move forward. So the next effect we will look at is this thing called the so I showed this thing called the fisheye effect. Now the fisheye effect is again another effect that changes the look of the sprite or the backdrop. What it does is that it makes the center part of the sprite large and distorted, or actually it's both ways, large or small but distorted, right? The analogy that I could think of here is that, think about this as though you are looking at the sprite through a magnifying glass, right? Now the valid range here is from -100 to any number, right? But what I find is that if you make it very, very large, then this whole thing starts to look odd, right? So I would say in practice, maybe -100 to say 500 or 600, say at most 1000, right? So let's look at some examples here. My original cat sprite, if I go and set fisheye to 0, right, this is what happens. Now notice if I set fisheye to 100, notice how the central part of the sprite has got a bit bulged, right? It's looking like swelling. It's kind of, I'm looking at it through the magnifying glass. When I make this 1000, then it really goes out of proportion, and the mouth has become so much bigger than the body. It looks odd, right? On the other hand, if I make it -100, it becomes totally broken, and in fact it doesn't change beyond -100, right? So we can apply this, let's say, in our code, and what I'll just do is that I will set, instead of, say, I'll go to the cat sprite and I'll say set, say, fisheye effect to maybe 0, right? And every, let's say, now and then I'll change fisheye effect by 25, right? So what I expect is that I'll start to see a bulge in the cat as it goes on, and in the meantime, the background is already doing the color effect, right? So background color will change, but you just focus on the sprite. Notice how its face is starting to bulge as it goes along, right? So it's becoming more and more distorted. At some point, like I said, it starts to look odd, and that number is typically around 500 or something like that, right? Or maybe at most 1000. After that, it looks really odd, right? In fact, you could also set this to say, I could say start from 0 and go -25, and what you will, maybe -25 is okay, yeah. What I notice is that at something like -100, so this guy starts to get contracted, but at -100, this is pretty much become stationary, right? That's why I said the valid range is from -100 to about, say, 1000, right? In fact, we can apply this to the backdrop as well. So let's focus. So if I did the same thing on the backdrop, say I say fisheye effect to 0 and change fisheye effect to 25. Now again, you can try different numbers, not just 25, but I'm just showing 25. Notice how it looks like I'm putting a magnifying glass on top of this center of this. So the center is getting bulged and it's becoming more and more distorted, right? So I can, remove this thing. Moving forward, let's say I look at the next effect, which is the world effect. Now, world effect is very interesting. World effect is like twisting the sprite or an image, right? And an analogy here again helps. It's as though you're kind of creating a vortex within the image, right? So, you notice this thing. It's like basically, if I have, let's say in the ocean, sometimes you have this ocean phenomenon like a vortex. So water starts to spiral inside. In the same way, a world effect will cause the sprite or the backdrop to twist. There's really no limit, but beyond -500 to 500, the effect doesn't look very pleasing. So I recommend you stick to this range. If I put 0 to 500, basically it's anti-clockwise twist, which means I go against the way the clock moves. A negative value, on the other hand, gives me a clockwise twist, right? So we can see that here. For example, say I start with my cat effect, cat sprite. I go set world effect to 0. Everything is normal. I start distorting it. Notice how it is getting sort of twisted in the in the anti-clockwise direction when I'm giving a positive number, and on the other hand, it's going twisted in a clockwise direction when I'm giving a negative number, right? And again, we can see this in code. It's quite interesting actually. So let's say I go back to my my cat here, and I tell it, okay, look, let's set the world effect to 0, right? And then later on, I go and change world effect to say by 25, right? So now what's going to happen is that it's going to start getting more and more twisted. Notice it's going anti-clockwise. In the meantime, the backdrop is doing this fisheye, right? So backdrop is getting bigger and bigger. My cat is getting more and more spiraled, right? In fact, we can, the still the same sprite. We have made it just become so twisted here. I could have actually gone the other way as well. So if I say, let's say minus 25, then it's just going to twist again, all right? But it's going to be in the other direction. So notice how it's going in the other direction, right? So now you can imagine that you can combine, let's say, a positive world and a negative world to create some very interesting movements for the costume, right? Like I said, right now our backdrop is still doing fisheye. We could certainly make it world. Let's say I made it world, and let's say I say world effect by 25. So what I can do is that I notice that the entire backdrop starts to kind of twist in a anti-clockwise direction, right? We can in fact see this on another backdrop just to be, just to kind of break the monotony a little bit. So if I see this, same thing starts to happen on the, on this backdrop, which is called, I think, Jurassic, right? So the effect concept is the same. We can apply it to let's say a sprite or to a background, right? Now, you can in fact combine these effects as well, right? So you can put say whirl along with maybe a color effect, right? So it will all work. Yeah. Moving forward, let's look at the next effect, which is the pixelate effect, right? Now, pixelate effect is really like creating a pixelated version of the image. Basically, what it does is that it converts converts the image into a grid of squares, right? So, or pixels, it's like something like this, right? So, an earth with pixelation will look like this. Now, what happens really is that there is really no limit, right? There's really no limit on this. You can put as much as you want, but what I find is that if you make the number very, very large, then the effect is not really very effective. It's not very attractive, let's say, right? So my recommendation is stick to something like 0 to 100, right? We can give positive and negative values, but then the effect is based on absolute value, which means minus 20 is same as 20, right? So if you look at some examples, for example, pixelate to 0 is, well, this. Pixelate to 50 is something like this. Notice that we are seeing pixelation with small squares. As I make it 100, the squares become bigger, and that's why I'm saying that if you make it very large, these squares will be too large and it will be quite distorted. Notice that if I do 50 or minus 50, the effect is the same. If I do 100 or minus 100, the effect is the same, right? So really, it can be, you can think of it as being valid from 0 to 100. Of course, beyond that also will work, but it will become very distorted, will not look very pleasant, right? So let's see this effect in action. I've gone to my cat sprite. Let's say I say set pixelate to 0, and thereafter change pixelation by say, let's say maybe make it 25, right? So I am always using 25, but you can always use different values. If I did this, now notice what happens. My cat starts to appear more and more pixelated, and beyond a point, it's almost unrecognizable. It's just become like a bunch of squares, right? So that's why very large values is not advised, right? You could do something like, maybe 100 is fine. So you can in fact do other way as well, right? So if you start with 100 and go to say minus 25, right? So if you did that, right, notice my cat will start to appear as though it was out of focus, then starts to get focused again. The reason it becomes blurred again is because, remember, this change group is learning forever, so it goes in the negative direction, and negative is same as positive, so it starts to pixelate once again, right? We can apply the same exact effect to our backdrop. So in this case, let's say I say pixelate, change pixelate effect by 25, and you will see the backdrop will also start to sort of pixelate, right? So you can use this effect obviously to create very interesting things, right? But once again, remember, if the pixelation is too much, it's almost unrecognizable, right? Let's move on. The next effect that we'll look at is this thing called the mosaic effect. Little bit confusing, but really it creates a mosaic of costumes, right? Mosaic of sprites and backdrops. Many copies in a grid, right? Now, the analogy that I could think of, which I thought is useful, is think about looking at your, sprite or the backdrop through a kaleidoscope. Now, if you have played with the kaleidoscope, you notice that it has a bunch of mirrors which create lots and lots of images. So mosaic effect is very similar. Basically, it creates lots and lots of small costumes within a costume, right? And the value range for this is positive numbers. Use perfect squares, which means, for example, 9, which is 3 cross 3, 3 times 3, 16, which is 4 times 4, 25, which is 5 times 5, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what it does is very interesting. So when I say mosaic effect to 9, I get something like, let's say, 4, because 9 is really 3 times 3, so it creates a 2 by 2 grid of costumes. And notice this is actually just one costume, but I've got 4 of these, right? Similarly, when I set it to 16, I get 9 of these. When I set mosaic effect to 25, I get 25 of this, right? So we can see this in code as well, right? So let's say I'll not change this because I just want to make sure it's just so let's say I set mosaic effect to 9 in case of so right now I'm coding for the backdrop. What you will notice is that you will have 9 different backdrops created, right? So sorry, 4 different backdrops created, because 9 is 3 times 3, and you get exactly one less than that. So 2 by 2 effect of backdrops. If I want to say 16, if I put it 16, I'm going to get a 3 cross 3 array of backdrops created, right? In the meantime, my cat is only doing pixelation. That's because I set it that way, but I can also make it to, let's say, set mosaic effect to. Now let's say I change this mosaic effect to say 64, which is 8 times 8. I expect to see again a bigger grid, and notice I've got a large number of cat sprites being created, but this is really one costume, which you can think of it as like single object, right? So that's the mosaic effect. Right now, let's move forward and look at the next effect, which is the brightness effect. Right now, this is simple to understand. It basically changes the way, the brightness of the sprite, right? So it makes it either brighter or darker, right? And the way to understand this, an analogy here is helpful also, is to think of this that you are taking a very bright torch and shining this light on the sprite, right? So for example, basically the value range here is -100 to 100. So if I made it -100, then this thing becomes totally dark. At 100 it becomes completely bright. So let's look at some examples here. So when I, for example, start with 0, as I go from 0 to 20 to 50 to 100, notice the sprite is becoming brighter and brighter, right? And at 100 it's totally just a white patch, right? On the other hand, if I go in the other direction, which is say -20, -50, and then at -100 it becomes totally dark, as though the light has been switched off, right? So I can see this in code here. So I'll say set maybe brightness effect to say maybe -100, right? And I can then say change brightness by, let's say, by say 25, right? So if I did that, notice what happens is that my sprite starts to become more and more brighter, and at 100 basically it has reached the full brightness, and it's just totally bright after that. On the other hand, if I did set it to 100 and change it by say -25, then in this case sprite is going to get brighter, from bright to darker and darker, and at 0 of course it becomes normal, and it goes soon to -100, and that's why it becomes totally black in color, right? So I can also do this on the backdrop, right? So instead of say mosaic effect, let's say I say set brightness to maybe 0, right? And thereafter I change the brightness to maybe by 25, change brightness by 25. So if I did this, notice not only the sprite but also the backdrop itself disappears because it becomes too bright, right? So I can try this on another backdrop, let's say on the flowers, right? So if I did this, then I'm going rather fast with the backdrop. That's why it just it just disappears, right? But it's really there. It's just that there's a very bright light shining on it, right? Let's move to the next effect. The next effect is quite interesting. It's called the ghost effect. Ghost effect makes the sprite appear or disappear slowly. So it makes it more and more transparent, and hence it disappears. Now this is different from the brightness. And the best way to look at this is through an analogy. The analogy here is that the sprite or the backdrop is wearing an invisibility cloak, right? So, let's say you're wearing this magic gown, which makes you disappear, right? And it turns out that ghost effect of 0 makes you totally visible. That means if the cloak is not flowing any effect. Ghost effect of 100 makes you completely invisible, right? So notice here, when I go from 0, everything is visible. When I go to make it to 100, the sprite is there, but it's not visible, right? There's an important point. The sprite is there, but it's not visible. This is different from brightness, because brightness, we still saw you remember, either the black backdrop or the black sprite or the white sprite, but here the sprite is completely wearing an invisibility cloak, right? So we can see this here. Let's say I set ghost effect to say 100, and then I change the ghost effect to say -25, right? So the sprite will start completely disappearing, and then it appears here, right? And remember, below this valid values are only 0 to 100, so I can go from 0. If I go to 0 and say changes by say 25, then you notice that the sprite will basically disappear, right? So if I do this, sprite just disappears, right? So I can maybe set this to, maybe not brightness, but I can just set to a color effect so that the thing doesn't go away. Oh, my mistake here. So I should say also this to color effect to say 25. So the background stays, but notice the sprite just quietly disappears. Now this is very useful in animations, in games, and so on and so forth, right? So this is what you can do, right? Now, one important point here is that the sprite, it has disappeared, all right, but it is still there, right? So it's not like it's hiding, right? It's just there, but it has worn an invisibility cloak, right? To see that, I'm going to put a small code where I have this Avery, right? I have this Avery sprite. I'll bring this in. I've given it a code to go to a corner and glide towards the center. Notice that's where the cat is. And I have this code that once it touches the cat, it should hide, right? Now, what I will show you is that though the cat is not visible, in fact, it will hide, the Avery will hide, because the touching cat will still work. The reason is that the cat is there, but just invisible. Notice so I'll make our sprite disappear really, really fast, right? So I'll set this ghost effect to, for example, this thing, and this is 0.1 seconds. And for the Avery, I'll ask it to glide, let's say slowly, maybe say 8 seconds from 100, 150 to 00. So basically, by the time the Avery reaches there, the sprite has actually disappeared. But notice the sprite is actually there, and that's why this touching command worked. And that's very, very important, that the sprite was actually there. The moment I remove this, it comes back, right? Now, before I wrap this up, I did not talk too much about clearing graphic effects. You can use this in a code. For example, let's say right now I've set, for example, let's say I set ghost effect to maybe say 100, right? Which means the sprite will disappear. Maybe I can wait for a while, right? I can say wait for say 1 second, and then I say clear graphic effects, right? So if I did that, the sprite is going to reappear, right? Because the effect, whatever we have put, will be removed, right? So that's how you use this in the code, right? But of course, if you're removing the code, so sprite appears there, right? And that's because I set ghost effect to 100, so sprite disappeared, but after 1 second, this effect was cleared, right? I can do this also to, for example, say set pixelate to 100, wait 1 second, and then clear graphic effects. If I did that, then so the pixelation happens, but after 1 second, it becomes normal, right? So that's how you use clear graphic effects. With this, let's just summarize, so many effects. Let's just take a quick summary of those. A color effect changes the hue or the shade. Recommended range is between 0 and 200 because it's cyclic. After 200, it's same as 0 basically, right? Fisheye effect distorts the central part. Recommended range is -100 to 1000 or even lower, maybe 500, 600, right? Because the central part will become bigger or smaller. World will twist your sprite or a background, right? Clockwise or anti-clockwise. Recommended range is between -500 to 500. Pixelate will create pixelation, right? Recommended range again -100 to 100. Mosaic will create costumes in a grid, right? Multiple costumes in a grid. Again, use a number which is like 2 plus 2 by 2, 3 by 3, 4 by 4, and so on and so forth. 4 times 4, 5 times 5, and so on and so forth. Brightness will change the brightness of the sprite. -100 to 100 is recommended range. Ghost effect is changes transparency, like an invisibility cloak, 0 to 100. But remember that even when the sprite actually becomes invisible, it is there, right? It's just wearing an invisibility cloak, right? Now, like I said, you can mix and match these things to create effects that you would really like, right? I hope you found this useful. Take care, enjoy programming, enjoy Scratch. Bye bye. Thank you.